The diversity of our students is just so front and center. It is in our mission statement that it is also more diversity among the women who are in office. These students that come through our programs that we see every day here in this building, those are the women we want to see in office someday.
I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to sit down with you today, to meet you. This is my second time in the Eagleton Institute, so as we start off this conversation, I would like for you to take us on a journey. And we're not leaving our seats, but like explain this house, because the history of it, the history of the Institute is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, so the Institute is named for a woman named Florence Eagleton, who was a suffragist in Newark, New Jersey, and one of the founders of the National League of Women Voters. And she and her husband were New Jersey natives. He was a physician, she was an activist, and they had this wonderful deal that whoever died first, the other one was going to get to leave their money to the cause that they cared most about. And so had she died first, he was going to give it to medical school. And luckily for us, the actuarial gods worked in our favor, and he died first. And she left the money to the university for the civic education of young women and men. And so that was the founding of the Eagleton Institute of Politics back in 1956. There's a graduate fellowship program that is based here at Eagleton, has had a number of different iterations. I'm actually a graduate of the program, class of 1980, and at the time it was more closely affiliated with the political science department. The way the program works now, these are graduate students from disciplines across the university, across campuses, so very different, but it's all about making sure that there are generations of folks who come out of college, come out of graduate school, understanding politics and seeing the possible role for them in politics. It was really a professional master's degree program.
I have basically a million questions just based on that narrative.
Okay.
It speaks so much to me. You said that the money was left for the civic education of women and men. That phrase, civic education, is important.
Yes.
Tell me why it's so important.
Well, I think we feel it now more than ever how important civic education is. People do not understand how government works. They don't understand their role in government. They don't understand the process, and they're not necessarily feeling the same kind of responsibility to the institutions. And I think that's critically important. And it's core to everything that we do here at Eagleton. So at the Center for American Women in Politics, we have a program called New Leadership, National Education for Women's Leadership, where we're trying to demystify politics for college women and make sure that they see the avenues where they can connect, whether in their profession or as just advocates for things they care about while they go off and do other things in their lives. It's a program that we run here in New Jersey. It's the flagship program, but we also train other colleges around the country to run their own state-based programs for college women. And we now have partnerships in about 20 states. And we love this program because it's for Rutgers students, but it's also for students across the state of New Jersey. We have kids who are, they've started at community college, they come to Rutgers with us for 6 days, it's a residential program, and when they finish, they want to come back to Rutgers to finish their 4-year degree. So it's been a great program, and it really is about demystifying politics and letting letting folks know the ways in which they can engage. We have nonpartisan campaign training programs for women because we want women to feel empowered to run for office, and then just studying women's participation in politics. But there are programs throughout the Institute that are doing this kind of work.
So I'm going to ask a couple devil's advocate questions.
Okay.
This sounds so old-fashioned.
Yeah.
I'm being provocative.
Yeah.
Like this sound, civic education, so
Yeah.
old-fashioned, demystifying politics. What's the big deal?
You know, if you have no understanding of these institutions, and it is old-fashioned, right? And you know, I'm going to date myself. We had civics in school, starting in junior high school and high school. You learned about these institutions, and you might not always agree with those institutions. I certainly grew up in an era where it was rebelling against these institutions, but you understood how those institutions worked and they mattered. And I think part of what we're seeing right now is in the kind of disrespect for institutions, not understanding them, an impatience with government, because there's no understanding of how government works and the important role that government plays in our lives. Protecting us, taking care of the infrastructure in this country, protecting rights of individuals and seeing the value in that. It really has been feeling like the democracy is in deep peril. And
Yes.
there are many things that could help it, but I think one of them is actually teaching people. It seems so elementary, right? Teaching people how government works. There are numbers that are involved here, and votes and counts, and why voting matters, and why voting rights matter. All of this is connected, and if we don't pay attention to it, we'll lose our democracy.
I grew up in the DC area, and my father was involved in politics as a chief of staff, and then on the other side, I worked as a lobbyist. And we had civics education still. I think I was probably the last generation to get civics education, generally speaking. But I do remember it got a little silly at times. When my father asked me how many members there were in Congress, I said 535. You didn't list the non-voting delegates. And I was like, Dad, I'm 8. I mean, I was, so, but I absolutely grew up in this atmosphere where knowing the fundamentals is critical. You can't run unless you know how to walk.
That's right.
You can't write experimental prose unless you know what rule you're breaking in writing the experimental prose. Like you need to know the basics. And I share a concern that we've drifted quite a far distance from knowing these basics. And they are not, it's not a liberal idea, it's not a conservative idea, it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's not independent, it's just the basics.
Right. It's what this country was founded on.
That's right.
It's the structure that we operate in.
With beautiful founding documents that are deeply flawed as well, but that's the point of the experiment.
And you have to know the documents.
Yes,
you have to
that's right.
understand so that you know you can see the flaws, and then you can work to change things. So it is deeply, critically important.
Amen. In a very nonpartisan separation of church and state
Yes.
way. Amen. Let me be devil's advocate again. If we're talking about the importance of educating everybody, why focus on women? And okay, maybe earlier we needed to focus on women, but not why still?
Women are still very underrepresented when it comes to their positions within government and politics. Less than a third of the members of Congress, just about a third of state legislators, less than a third of mayors of big cities, about a third of all municipal office holders. There are still barriers that are out there. It would be nice to think that, oh, it's 2022, we don't need this anymore. But we do. There are still challenges and barriers that women face to running for office, to holding office, to leading, to working in government that are different. And I think that kind of work is still critically important. I love actually that you asked the question in that way, because when the center was founded 50 years ago, one of the things that people said about our work was that there's no subject there to study. I mean, what after you count the very small number
Yes.
of women who are serving, what on earth would you study? And now 50 years later, the question is, well, why do you still need this? Because everything is fixed. Everything is not fixed. We've been talking a lot about the fact that we talk about parity. We talk about parity as numbers, but it's beyond numbers, right? It's also parity in power. And even in New Jersey, where we're doing better than we have been for women serving in our state legislature, frankly, we're the best we have ever been. We're still not in the top 10 for percentage of women serving in our state legislature. But when the decisions are being made about who's running things and who's going to lead, it's still a cabal of men, mostly white men, who get together and make those decisions, and women are not at the table.
But why does that matter? I mean, great ideas can come from men. Rumor has it. So why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the importance of diversity of ideas. You know, you need different voices at the table. I mean, in many ways, that's what a representative democracy is supposed to be, right? It's about having different perspectives, different voices, different life experiences, because in fact, that's what's going to make policy better. It's going to make it more reflective. And our research has shown that women who serve in office are more likely to bring issues that affect women, families, children. They'll be on the policy agenda. It's not that men don't support those things, but it takes some different voices being at the table to get them raised. It's why we want to see more women and more people of color, and we want to see LGBTQ representation. We want a range. We want our government to be reflective of who is serving. And I don't think it serves our state or our nation well when the decisions that are being made are not being made with women fully at the table. And not just the numbers that are in the overall, but in the leadership and when those meetings happen. There's that notion of the meeting that happened before the meeting. And at the meeting before the meeting, we need to make sure that there are some of those different voices
the room where
there.
it happened.
Yes.
This is the leading center for the study of women in politics in the country.
Yep.
But it had to start from somewhere, from a place where you already said, why do you want to study? There's nobody there to study, which is, by the way, the story of my own field. Like, why do you have to have then called Afro-American Studies? What's there to be learned? Like, well, the history of the country. I mean, so get us into the founding of COP and then your involvement in COP.
We were founded in 1971, which was in the midst of the second wave of the feminist movement, but the movement had been largely focused on individuals. And in about 1971, there was kind of a revelation about politics and government, and that instead of always being on the outside trying to affect change or looking at your own personal life and how do you affect change, it was expanded to think about, well, how do we get these voices, our voices, women's voices, inside these institutions? And here at Eagleton, there were actually a couple of women who were connected to Eagleton, but not part of Eagleton, who brought the idea of a center here. It was very much a laissez-faire system here. If you could raise the money, you could do it. So they went to the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation gave a small grant to start, and the university matched some of the funding for that. So there was some funding here, and actually my very good friend, my very close friend, who was one of the two founding directors of the center, Ruth Mandel, came on, and at the time she was an English major, English PhD, had moved back because her husband got a job at Rutgers, and she thought, well, I saw that there was a little ad in the paper about this new center forming. I can go and volunteer. And while I'm doing work on my novel or on the research that I was doing, and they ended up hiring her. And it's a great story, right? Because she didn't have a big background in politics, but she had great ideas. And the other woman who came on with her is a woman named Ida Schmertz. And Ida and Ruth became the co-founding directors of the Center for American Women in Politics. They convened the first national conference of women state legislators in 1972. And it was like an anthropological study, like who were these women? They cataloged who were the women. I just found the cards.
In holding political office, you're saying?
Holding state legislative office. Eagleton has always had a focus on state legislatures at the time. So that was sort of the logical place. It was the highest level of office that they thought had a concentration of women in it. They wrote to League of Women Voters and state houses. This is all before computers. And I found all these little cards that they had the name and the address and the phone number and some information about every woman state legislator that they were all handwritten.
And so data collection.
It was data collection. It was counting.
Yes.
You can't solve the problem until you define the problem, and numbers help you define the problem. So then you know. They thought there was underrepresentation, but now we had a number to attach to it. So they gathered all of this information, and then they brought a handful of women state legislators together to just say, who are you? What makes you tick? Why did you do this? And what's it like being in a state legislature as a woman, as probably one of only 2 or 3 women in your state? And they hired a political scientist to write a book about it, and that political scientist was Jean Kirkpatrick. And she was a pretty unknown political scientist at the time, and she wrote probably the first definitive book called Political Woman based on that conference.
That's amazing. So this is amazing. First of all, I love the fact that this was data collection at the start. It has become almost a fad over the last 10 or 15 years in higher ed. What are the metrics? What are the metrics? We have to measure these things. COP was doing it 50 years ago, doing it from the beginning, and doing a mixture of quantitative and qualitative research and putting that together.
Absolutely. We issued the first volumes, Women in Public Office. Now that seems so antiquated because, of course, it was probably out of date by the time it was printed. And we continue to do that work. We continue to track women as office holders, women as candidates, and women as voters. So that data is critically important.
I mean, this strikes me as, this is fundamental work, right? Doing this kind of regular, steady database collection, making that data available to other researchers, this is so critical because you're able to look back longitudinally at trend lines and start to wonder why this happened or why that happened, and then you have the data behind it. This is a big deal. You mentioned it briefly in passing. This is an era where people are really asking questions about institutions. This is an era, second wave feminism, what people called for a while post-civil rights activism. And these two worlds came together in complicated ways. And just help us understand that moment, really, late 60s into the mid 70s. It was a very unusual time in American politics.
It was a tumultuous time. There was an enormous amount of activism, civil rights movement, women's movement, anti-war movement. I mean, there was a lot going on leading up to that time of the creation of the center. And we weren't alone in our founding. At the it's not by chance, I think, that we were founded in July of 1971, and the National Women's Political Caucus was founded in 1971 by women like Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm and Gloria Steinem. And it really was that moment when the second wave of the feminist movement met politics.
Yes.
And the Women's Political Caucus was the activist arm. And the center, I mean, at the time, nobody knew that it would become, but the center, this was the beginning of our role as, in many ways, the backbone of the women's political movement. The keeper of the data, the shaper of the narrative, the folks doing the research to ask those questions of why does it matter?
Yes.
As you were saying, why do we care? Why does it matter? What difference do those women make? How do they get there? How is it different than their male colleagues? We were doing that research. We still are doing that research because politics changes and the answers to those questions change.
Yes.
But it that research has informed the practice and the activism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think in many ways we're the most proud of, that we here at a university can provide that. We're training students, and that's incredibly important. But we're also having an impact on the work that's being done outside of the university to help make that kind of social change.
How did you find yourself in this place? What was your experience growing up in that moment of political tumult?
So I grew up in an equally political place as you grew up, but very different. I grew up in the West Village in New York City in the 60s and 70s. And
Very intense time.
Yeah, a very
That
intense
area.
time. And my parents were very political. One of my earliest memories, I have sort of it's a little pairing. My mother took me to a demonstration in Washington Square Park when I was I must have been just under 3. I don't remember the demonstration. It was we have a clipping of it from the NYU newspaper. It's a picture of me holding my hands over my ears when the air raid signal went off. It was
my
a ban
goodness.
the bomb demonstration. My memory is of being in front of the Women's House of Detention, which was at the time in the middle on Greenwich Avenue, in the middle of Greenwich Village, and getting an ice cream cone at Sutter's while I was in a stroller. And I have this very vivid memory of eating this ice cream cone
Right.
as we marched in front of the House of Detention demanding that these women be released. So that's a really early memory, and that's the kind of household that I grew up in. Politics was absolutely something we talked about, we discussed. She was a feminist. My parents were involved in the anti-war movement. It was the Village Independent Democrats with, at the time, a very progressive Ed Koch. I mean, I'm thinking about
Right,
that was
right.
it was a certain time.
Yes.
I always knew I wanted to do something with women's rights, and I thought I would go to law school. I always thought I would go to law school. I applied to law schools and I took my LSATs, but I also took my GREs, and I was looking at graduate programs, and I was working as a temp in an office where I didn't have a lot to do. And I remember I read an article in the New York Times, in the style section of the New York Times, about this relatively new center that had opened up, and it was perfect
Wait, in
for
the
me.
style section?
In the style section of the New York Times.
It's its own commentary
Yes,
right there.
and that's
yes.
where this kind of
Okay.
a story would have been. And it was about this relatively new center at Rutgers University, and I wrote a little note to this woman, Ruth Mandel, and said, do you have a graduate program there? And she wrote back and said, we don't have a graduate program, but Eagleton does. And if you came here, you might, connect to us. And that's how I came to Eagleton. It was at the time a 1-year master's program, 5 graduate courses a semester. It was pretty intense. I
Okay.
made some connections to the folks at the center because that's what got me here. And when I was getting ready to graduate, I had actually deferred law school, and I really knew then that's not what I wanted to do. And a woman who was at the center, at the time the associate director, a woman named Kathy Stanwyck, said, I was talking to her about what was I going to do next, and she said, well, I know this woman who's a county supervisor in Black Hawk County, Iowa, and she's running for Congress. And maybe you should just go out there and work on this campaign. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, I've never been to Iowa. I never did a year abroad, so this kind of would be my
Sure.
year
Yeah, from the
abroad in a
village to
different
Iowa?
culture,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
They offered me the job of being the driver of the candidate. And I said, great, yes, and I hung up the phone. But the only hitch, of course, was I did not know how to drive because I grew up in New York City. And so in addition to all the many things that faculty at Eagleton gave to me, they also helped me learn how to drive. A lovely guy who used to work here, ran a transportation center, took me out on the New Jersey Turnpike, very
God.
calm. And I learned to drive. I got my license on a Thursday, and I left for Iowa on a Friday.
Now, I would not advocate this as an internship strategy for
I think
students.
it's a great lesson in just say yes, and you'll figure it out.
Just say yes.
Just
Okay,
say
fair
yes, and
enough.
you'll figure it
Yeah.
out. I only drove the candidate once. I think she picked up right away that this was not a good idea, and I became a field organizer, and
Okay.
I loved it.
And I worked for a campaign as well. And my super sexy job was stuffing envelopes, getting paper cuts on my tongue
Yep.
from licking them, putting a stamp and getting to the mailbox over and over and over again. But it actually makes a difference because that is the word getting out to people.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of our younger generation need to understand that that stuff is critical.
Well, we get students all the time who come, we work with them on getting an internship and helping place them in offices of political people, whether it's elected officials or advocacy organizations, but kind of getting them in the door. And we'll occasionally get a student who says, I'm just filing these papers, or I'm just answering these letters. We're saying, everything in that office is important. You listen to everything that's going on around you. You read everything that you're filing. Read it. Don't just put it in. Look at it. It's all about understanding and learning how this world works. And you can get so much out of that. And I always tell students, no job is beneath you.
That's right. That's right.
And the more you do, the more responsibility they're going to give you. And that's what I learned. I mean, I just jumped in with both feet, and I became an important part of the campaign for them. I didn't have a big title, but I knew I was doing something that made a difference.
And I suspect you had those experiences there, but they informed so many other things that you did.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when we lost, it was 1980, wasn't a good year. She was a Democrat. And we lost, and there were all of the advocacy organizations for women were being flooded with people who needed jobs because so many people had been displaced off of the Hill. And so the same person who sent me out to Iowa said, we're applying for a grant to do a 10-year anniversary conference of women state legislators. And you could come back and do that if we get the grant. And in the meantime, we're doing a study of women's routes to office. And you could do some survey coding and actual interviewing, because we were doing the interviewing ourselves. So I came back, to do that, and I never left.
And I haven't gotten rid of you yet.
I wouldn't leave. I wouldn't leave. And I've done all kinds of different jobs while I've been here and had amazing experiences, because this place is always changing.
Yes.
I mean, I've been involved in the research piece. We've done national conferences with over 1,000 political women coming together. We used to do those every 4 years before partisan politics got so difficult and it was so hard to do that kind of a meeting. We made a documentary film that aired on Frontline with 6 million viewers.
Wow.
I was the associate producer on that film. It's because my job changes all the time, and because we're growing all the time, developing new programs, and we're part of the incredible luxury of being both in a university and the knowledge creation and the excitement of a university, and being cutting edge on all kinds of issues around political participation, but also being able to have that foot in the world of the real politics.
So theory and applied.
Absolutely.
So I've been asking you tons of questions. I could keep going, truly. But I want to give you the chance to ask me a question, if you have one.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So Rutgers is rich with work on gender. We are just one example. We are part of a consortium of programs at the Institute for Women's Leadership. So there's Douglas College, there's the Center for Women in Work, there's the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and among others. There are many others. But there's also individual scholars who are doing tremendous work focused on gender in the history department and women's and gender studies across disciplines. It's so rich here. And I'm just wondering in what ways you might think about lifting that work up across the board, both within the university, because sometimes I think we're better known outside the university than we are inside the university, but also nationally, because it is something I think Rutgers should be so proud of.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I was inaugurated this past fall. Hope you know that.
I heard.
Yes. And the theme of the inauguration is that this is, quote, "This is what excellence looks like." Now, my experience with investitures is presidents are forecasting out, and I will do these things, or we will go in these directions. And that's totally understandable. I get it. I did some of that myself. But it was very important for me to say, this is what excellence looks like. Because it's a diagnostic. It's like, look around. Right now, right here, we already have this gym. Can it get better? Of course it can. That's one of the reasons I thought I might come here, because I could do what I can to help it become better. But I really found, and it frustrates me, is that we don't do a good job telling our own story on whatever topic. That somehow we seem to be afraid of saying, "Hey, we're really good."
Yeah.
Like really, really good. And you look at a place like COP, and it's the best place in the country to study these topics. And I don't understand why we aren't shouting that from the rooftops. So one of the things in talking with Pete McDonough, our head of government relations, oversees marketing and communications, I sort of identified this. I'm like, this is frustrating to me. And he goes, "We need to do better, but we need the resources to do better." Like, well, resources, that's stuff I have some control over. So we've actually done the work now. I've directed resources to that program in order to tell the story, in order to say, look, all around you, there are amazing things going on here. Your observation is exactly right. And the diagnosis, we don't do this job well.
Yeah.
And so the answer is that we are going to do this job more and more. In fact, the most recent issue of the alumni magazine, This Is What Excellence Looks Like, is front and center featuring the first season of Faces and Voices, featuring the members of the Distinguished Hall of Alumni. And if you look at the faces, that's a different Rutgers than you would have seen featured in that sort of article 15 years ago,
That's
30
right.
years ago, 50 years ago, radically different. This is an important part of our story. And it's about researchers on topics related to gender, women's and gender studies. It's related to COP. It's about trying to do our best to tell a story that already exists. And I'm committed to doing it.
That's great. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
It's my pleasure.
I have to tell you that one of the highlights of when you first came, you put out an email about, I've been at the university for a few months now, and here are the 10 things I'm really impressed with, and you had the center in there. I wrote you a note thanking you for that, because in my 40 years, I had never seen a president feature the center in that way.
Yes.
And within the university, which I thought was really important. And I have to say that I had a very emotional moment, because Ruth Mandel had just passed away recently, and I thought, oh, she would have loved this. This would have made her so proud.
I had an emotional moment as well. Maud, her daughter,
Yes.
and I were peer deans before she became president at Williams and I became president here. I didn't know about the family connection.
Yeah.
And after her mother had passed away, or Maud wrote me a note, and it was very tender, saying, "I wish my mother had been around for this moment."
Yeah.
That got me.
Well, she got to know that you were coming. I will tell you that.
Okay.
She was very excited.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So she didn't get to see you inaugurated, but she did get to know that you were next in line, and she was very excited about that.
And now we have work to do.
Yeah, a lot
Thank
of
you
work
so
to do.
much.
Thank you.
This is
Really
absolutely
enjoyed this.
fabulous.
Yeah, thank you.